Convoys Wharf has of course evolved quite substantially over the last 500 or 600 years. When Henry VIII founded it, it was largely a green area. It was an area of marshes and fields and a small settlement that was called Deptford Strand. He created the foundation facilities, the great wet dock, the great dry dock and the storehouse, the remains of which are still below ground. For the Navy, for most of its history, it was the centre for research and development. The master shipwright who lived here was the most important in the Navy, and this is where new ideas such as the Lennox that Pepys was responsible for pushing through were developed and were built. It remained a very important shipbuilding centre. That continued into the 19th century, but by this stage, as ships were getting gradually larger and larger and the river was silting up, it became increasingly difficult for the biggest naval vessels to use the yard. So in the 1820s, the decision was taken to stop shipbuilding. That was then reversed in the 1840s when suddenly the Navy started to build steam-powered ships and needed extra capacity. But very quickly after that, in the 1860s, iron-hulled warships were invented and the yard became very rapidly obsolete. It simply wasn't big enough for this new technology. So the site was sold. Part of it became the foreign cattle market for the import of cattle to feed London. Part of it was kept by the Navy and the other part was a revival of Sayes Court, the extraordinary garden of John Evelyn, which in the 17th century was one of the most celebrated gardens in the country. Into the 20th century, it actually went back into military use and was a storage depot used in both World Wars. After 1945, it's a story of gradual decline and abandonment, although many of the historic structures still survive, until News International acquired it in the 1980s and it took on its sort of modern use as an import yard for newsprint. When all the warehouses everyone's very familiar with Cape went up and a lot of above ground remains were destroyed. Because of the extraordinary history of this site, we've been undertaking the largest archaeological investigation, pre-application investigation in London in an awful long time, and in fact the largest archaeological investigation of any dockyard anywhere in the world. And that's produced an enormous amount of information.
Well, the key things we're doing on the site at the moment is uncovering the archaeology of the dockyard, recording, planning it, and then we're going to cover it back over so that it can be incorporated and protected in the context of the development. What we're looking at here is one of the dockyard slipways. This is slipway number 1, and in this form it was built in 1845. The ships were built and constructed on this wooden deck we can see in front of us here, and I'm standing on one of the side walls of the slipway, which even at that date was built in brick and in concrete. And they're experimenting with these new materials in the construction of dockyards. One of the things we have found is that because of the scale of the later dockyard construction in the 19th century, much of the earlier 18th century and 17th century dockyard has actually been destroyed by that 19th century construction. But if we look over here, we've actually got the remains of several phases of the dockyard basin, starting off with the brick wall in the distance, which is the dockyard of basin of 1814, moving into an intermediate brick wall, which is the basin of about 1800, and then behind that you can see we've actually got the mid-18th century basin wall, which is in timber. And the survival of that is because the basin over time has actually got much, much smaller as they've deepened it to accommodate the larger ships. What we're basically doing here is ensuring that that importance is recognised in the context of the development and the remains are preserved as a resource for future generations, so that perhaps when the site's maybe redeveloped again in a few hundred years' time, these remains will still be here as a resource for the future. So what we do is once we've finished recording is actually cover everything and backfill it over, but because we've got such detailed records, we know precisely where the remains are, so those can be worked on by the engineers designing the development to actually avoid the archaeology and put the development over the top of it.
There are still fragments underground which are reasonably well preserved, and we're looking to see how they can inform the development as it goes forward. Now, there could be in a number of different ways, but where the archaeology is robust enough, there may be the possibility of exposing it. For example, at the entrance to the Great Dock, that's a bit of masonry which might well be robust enough to reveal and expose and celebrate But otherwise, you can still use the archaeology to inspire and inform the development and the master plan, and that's something that we're looking at now. We've been working very closely with English Heritage to look at the history and understand the significance of the site and its archaeology, and to ensure that's properly preserved and conserved into the future, and also to make sure that that wonderful history informs the development of the master plan.